The mystery letter on a mild gray morning in the small village of Breton. Miss Marple sat comfortably in her snug sitting room, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. The early light filtered softly through the lace curtains, casting delicate shadows on the worn wooden floor outside. The quiet hum of the village beginning its day was gently punctuated by the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the cool breeze. Miss Morel, with her ever-observant eyes, viewed the placid sight with a quiet satisfaction, fully aware that even the calmest days could conceal the most extraordinary incidents. She was about to restore her focus to the daily crossword problem. A knock at the door interrupted Rhee's silence. Opening the door, she discovered a postal delivery man holding an abnormally big package. The envelope, made of heavy paper with an unimpressive seal, contained a handwriting that was both hasty and distressing. The penmanship, while not the work of a skilled scribe, held an earnest urgency that immediately grabbed her curiosity. Miss Marple accepted the letter with a polite gesture and closed the door behind her before returning to her favorite recliner by the window. Miss Marple delicately broke the seal as she unfolded the letter. The familiar aroma of paper and ink filled the air. The message was brief, but imbued with an emotion that resonated profoundly with her well-tuned intuition for disaster. Read, "My dear Miss Morel, I fear that what has been described as suicide is in fact a murder. My vibrant sister passed away unexpectedly. I beg you to come and explore." Her eyes, magnified slightly behind her spectacles, twinkled as she read and reread the words. The letter's measured tone, along with the evident pain in its phrasing, suggested that its author was not only seeking a conclusion to a troubling occurrence, but was also yearning for the truth to be discovered. Miss Marple's heart, long attuned to the complexities of human nature, felt a stirring of both sympathy and the excitement of a difficult puzzle for many years. Miss Marple had enjoyed the quiet routine of village life, rarely venturing far from home unless the call of duty was unmistakable. But as she sat there, the promise of a puzzle, a chance to peel back the layers of human deceit and hidden sorrow, was irresistible. She mused over the few details presented. A reported suicide that did not quite fit the mold of its tragic nature, and a sister who believed, against all appearances, that murder was a play. The letter's ambiguity was a cautious selection of words. The emphasis on her sister being full of life, together with the urgent need for help, all hinted at a deeper story waiting to be revealed. Miss Marple's mind, always analytical and perceptive, began to piece together the different situations. With the quiet deliberation of someone who has spent a lifetime observing the human condition, rising slowly from her armchair, she padded over to the small writing desk crowded with various letters and images, a monument to her lengthy career in quietly uncovering mysteries. She carefully placed the letter among her collection of unsolved enigmas, sat back, and examined its implications. Each word had a hidden meaning. Perhaps the sister, in her agony, felt contradictions in the official narrative. Perhaps there were secrets buried in the family's past that needed to be brought to light. The kettle, which had long since lost its whistle, now sat cooling on the table, a simple reminder that time does not wait for anyone. Miss Marple poured herself another cup of tea, the steam rising in delicate curls that danced in the soft morning light. As she sipped the warm liquid, she mentally rehearsed the journey ahead. This investigation would most likely lead her into the complexities of family dynamics, the subtle shifts of allegiances, and the unspoken grievances that often fuel such tragic events. Her eyes returned to the letter, and she smiled quietly, resolutely. Miss Marple murmured, "I suppose it's time." It was not merely the call of duty that moved her, it was the deep-seated belief that every life, every lost soul deserved justice, and every mystery, no matter how well hidden, was meant to be solved in that moment. The serene tranquility of little Bren was gently disrupted by the promise of upheaval, a mystery that would soon weave its way into the very fabric of her life. The letter, with its stark message and subtle hints of despair, had set in motion a series of events that Miss Marple could not ignore, and so, with her mind already alert to the clues and red herrings that lay ahead, she began to prepare for the journey to come, knowing full well that beneath the calm exterior of a small village the human heart was a labyrinth of secrets waiting to be discovered. Thus, the stage was quietly set for another of Miss Marple's adventures, a delicate interplay of truth and deception that would test not only her keen intellect but also her unfailing belief in the inherent goodness of those who sought justice. Chapter 2. The grieving sister. Miss Marple's journey led her through winding lanes and past fields of golden hay until she arrived at a modest, ivy-clad cottage on the outskirts of a sleepy town. The building, with its worn stone facade and a small garden overflowing with late-blooming roses, exuded an air of quiet dignity and hidden sorrow. As she approached the weathered front door, she couldn't help but notice the faint scent of lavender, mingling with the autumn air, a small detail that hinted at happier Mrs. Elena Cartwright, as Miss Marple would later learn. Exhibited a kind, although worn visage, her eyes red-rimmed and clouded with grief, betraying the inner pain of a heart steeped in loss, and a delicate trembling voice. Elena escorted Miss Marple into the small sitting room, where the light fell in soothing patches across fading floral wallpaper and a modest array of well-worn armchairs. After relaxing into a well-appointed albeit simple armchair, Mrs. Alice began, speaking in a measured tone that mixed sorrow with skepticism. After 2 months, her voice began to waver, like a delicate leaf caught in a spring breeze. My beautiful sister Catherine, who had finally found happiness in a love marriage, was radiant with delight. I had never seen her so alive and full of promise. She paused for a moment to collect herself, her eyes expressing the sorrow of a wound that had not yet begun to heal. Miss Marple listened closely, her attention locked on Mrs. Ellis's shaking hands as they grasped a faded image of Catherine, a cheerful face that now appeared to belong to a world so different from the one characterized by tragedy. Catherine was always the spirit of the family, Elena continued. Her laughter filled every room and her kindness was as natural as the morning sun. So when word came that she had attempted to take her own life, I was struck dumb with disbelief. The words spoken with a bitter tang of incredulity hung heavily in the air. In that moment, Miss Marple's thoughts turned over the stark contradiction in front of her. A woman so full of life could scarcely be imagined as capable of the, Elena whispered, her voice barely above a whisper, as if a cruel twist of fate has rewritten her destiny. And I am left with a tapestry of falsehoods and half-truths. As the conversation evolved, Miss Marple took note of every nuance. The slight quiver in Mrs. Alice's voice, the way her eyes darted towards a dusty window, as if expecting some unspoken visitor, and the occasional sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world. All these small details observed with quiet intensity suggested that the grief expressed was genuine, but it also hinted at secrets that lay just beneath the surface. Mrs. Alice's recollection of Catherine's recent happiness painted a vivid picture of her sister brimming with hope and love. That day she was radiant, and for a brief, blissful moment, it felt as if nothing could mar her joy, but that joy, so ephemeral and fragile, was broken by an incident that defied all sense with every word. Miss Marple's thoughts planned out the emerging puzzle. There was the official narrative, a suicide reported by the police. And then there was the calm conviction of a loved sister who knew in her bones that something was badly wrong. I beseech you, Miss Marple, Elena pleaded softly, believe me when I say that my sister's death was no accident of despair. Something sinister must have happened. The desperation in her tone was unmistakable, a cry for help in the midst of an overwhelming storm of sorrow and suspicion. As the afternoon wore on, the two women sat in a silence punctuated only by the ticking of an ancient clock on the mantelpiece. Miss Marple, ever the attentive observer, let the stillness speak for itself. It was a silence filled with memories, regrets, and a calm desire to uncover the hidden truths that lay beneath the curtain of official reports. The unspoken question hung in the air: was Catherine driven to suicide by some secret anguish, or was there a darker force at play? A murder carefully camouflaged to appear as self-destruction in that humble sitting room? The borders between truth and deception began to blur. Mrs. Alice's passionate testimony, laden with pain and plagued with uncertainty, served as the first link in a tangled web of clues. Miss Marple's mind raced, drawing on years of expertise in discerning the subtle signals of human behavior. Each gesture, every pause added to a building picture of a terrible incident that was not as straightforward as it could have appeared at first glance. Before bidding farewell, Miss Morell assured Mrs. Alice that she would look into the matter with all the care and diligence it deserved. Rising from her chair, Miss Marple offered a gentle smile, a quiet promise that the truth would be pursued, no matter how deeply it was buried. As she stepped back into the crisp afternoon air, the modest cottage receded behind her, leaving her with a heavy heart and an unyielding determination, thus drawing the day to a close. Miss Marple's mind was already buzzing with questions. Catherine's smile lingered in her mind. The enigma, it seems, was not just a matter of public record, but a personal tragedy that demanded resolution, a problem that Miss Marple was especially prepared to address. Chapter 3: A House of Secrets. Miss Marple's next trip was the mansion where Catherine had previously filled every room with her bright presence. The Hoare family home, a huge yet modest estate on the edge of town, was a study in contrasts, with its well-kept gardens and imposing front. As Miss Marple walked along the gravel path, she couldn't help but note that even the roses and bushes, tended with such care, seemed to whisper secrets of their own. As she approached the towering front door, Miss Marple was greeted by a quiet flurry of activity inside the drawing room, which was elegantly appointed with antique furnishings and family portraits that spoke of generations of carefully preserved honor. The atmosphere was simultaneously refined and stifling, as if the very air carried a weighty charge of unspoken grievances and hidden truths. Her gaze was drawn to the commanding figure of Mrs. Victoria, the formidable mother-in-law with keen eyes and a tightly drawn expression. Mrs. Beatrix exuded authority and a preoccupation with maintaining the family's reputation. Her measured gestures and precise diction suggested that she regarded any disruption, especially one as delicate as a death under mysterious circumstances, with the utmost seriousness. When she greeted Miss Morelle, her politeness was tinged with an imperceptible coolness that hinted at long-held suspicions and a relentless desire to control the narrative. Miss Morelle was then shown to the other members of the home. Mr. Allen Henry, the elder son, stood at a window that overlooked the manicured lawn. Despite claiming to work out of town, his appearance on the day in question was both unexpected and confusing. He had an air of restrained charm, yet his look seemed remote, as if he were always measuring his words against an inner ledger of secrets. The faint set of his jaw, and the occasional nervous twitch, betrayed more than his calm exterior let on. In stark contrast was Mr. Bernard Henshaw, Catherine's youngest son and husband, whose unease was palpable. His eyes flitted about the room, and his hands fidgeted restlessly as if searching for something to steady his nerves each time the subject of Catherine arose. His voice lowered, and his words became measured, suggesting that his grief was intertwined with hidden disquiet. He exuded vulnerability, a gentle admission of inner pain that was difficult to conceal beneath courteous smiles. Mrs. Eleanor, Alan's wife, rounded out the company, whose casual demeanor and seemingly effortless ease belied a complexity that Miss Marple's discerning eyes quickly noted. Elaine's smile was pleasant but lacked the warmth one might expect from someone so closely connected to the family tragedy. Instead, it was as if she maintained a careful distance, a protective barrier between herself and the painful realities unfolding around her. Taking her place in an unoccupied armchair, Miss Marple began her silent labor of observation. She sipped her tea gently and allowed herself to be absorbed by the exquisite interplay of light, sound, and gesture that filled the area. Every detail was a clue. The slight twitch of Mrs. B's lips as she glanced at a portrait of Catherine, the way Mr. Allen's fingers fiddled with his cufflinks whenever Catherine's death was mentioned, and the rapid, almost imperceptible tapping of Mr. Bernard's fingers on the armrest of a nearby chair. Over the course of the afternoon, polite conversation flowed around her. Though the topics were invariably circumscribed by careful restraint, the family spoke warmly of Catherine. The brightness of Miss Marple gathered her impressions with methodical precision. She had long mastered the art of reading between the lines of human behavior, and today, each subtle gesture and fleeting expression contributed to a growing picture of a household steeped in both affection and underlying mistrust. Before leaving, Miss Marple offered courteous nods and gentle smiles to each family member, her mind already piecing together the disparate clues that hinted at hidden resentment. Miss Marple stepped back into the cool evening air. The house, with its elegant veneer and the echoes of whispered confessions, had left her with as many questions as answers. But she was determined to probe deeper, for in the intricate web of family ties and veiled emotions lay the path to uncovering the truth behind Catherine's mysterious end. And Miss Marple was resolved to follow that path until every hidden secret was brought to light. Chapter 4. Suspicions arise over. Miss Marple glided effortlessly through the Henshaw household, engaging each member with soft, innocent queries. The air was dense with an undercurrent of anxiety, as if everyone in the family was guarding a secret behind. Though the family members professed heartfelt sadness about Catherine, the statements they provided were laced with strange comments and subtle discrepancies, facts that set Miss Marple's seasoned mind on edge. Her first conversation was with Mrs. Beatrice Henshaw, the formidable mother-in-law, whose measured dignity and exact demeanor frequently hid her genuine thoughts. In the calm drawing room, adorned with family photos and time-worn furnishings, Mrs. Henshaw sat with an attitude of rigid serenity, graced with a dazzling spirit. She insisted, her tone clipped and formal. Her marriage, a relationship established on love, brought hope to our family. But as Miss Marple listened, she detected a rehearsed quality in these words, as if they had been carefully chosen to deflect attention from an unsaid truth. There was something about the way Mrs. Henshaw repeatedly emphasized the family's fortune and security that hinted at an underlying preoccupation with financial matters, rather than genuine mourning. Next, Miss Marple sought out Mr. Bernard Henshaw, Catherine's husband and the younger son of the family. I could not understand why she would take such a severe move. His voice shook slightly, as if exposing the weight of hidden regrets. But there was an odd obsession on the subject of money that crept into his words. When Miss Marple delicately probed his recollections of Catherine's final days, Bernard's eyes flickered with an expression of unease before quickly settling back into a mask of sorrow, as if he were reluctant to allow any discussion of finances, a topic that Miss Marple noted seemed to carry a different kind of significance for him in contrast to these measured responses. Mrs. Eleanor, the wife of Mr. Allen Henshaw, projected a facade of easy nonchalance in a cheerful, sunlit room near the conservatory. When the subject of Catherine's death arose, Elaine offered a gentle, almost dismissive smile. "It is all very difficult to comprehend," she said lightly, though her tone lacked the warmth one might expect from a person so intimately linked to the family tragedy. There was an air of detachment about her, as if the painful reality of the loss had been tempered by a premeditated decision to remain aloof. Her responses, though polite, seemed to steer the conversation away from Mrs. Henshaw's insistence on Catherine's good fortune. Was a recurring theme that connected the disparate narratives about money. Bernard's anxious hints of financial constraints, or Alan's infrequent but informative silences. When wealth was raised, the issue of monetary gain loomed big over every conversation. In hushed tones and brief glances, it became clear that the question of riches and its possible misuse was not only background chatter, but maybe a critical piece of the puzzle. Another thread that tugged at Miss Marple's attention was the matter of Catherine's missing jewelry. This detail, though mentioned only in passing by several of the family members, struck her as significant. The precious heirlooms that had once belonged to Catherine were conspicuously absent, a fact that no one in the household seemed willing to discuss openly. Each mention of the lost jewels carried with it an unspoken implication, a suggestion that they might have been part of a larger scheme, or that their disappearance was connected in some way to the events that had led to Catherine's death. By the time the late afternoon light cast long shadows along the corridors of the Henshaw home, Miss Marple had compiled a mental ledger of all the discrepancies, hesitations, and red herrings that the family's accounts presented. It was clear to her that beneath the calm surface of sorrow lay a web of ulterior motives, one in which the missing jewelry and the repeated allusions to money might hold the key to unraveling the true nature of Catherine's demise. With quiet determination and a resolve born of years of unraveling human intricacies, Miss Marple prepared to delve even deeper into this tangled web. Every conversation, every carefully measured reply, and every evasive glance had added another brushstroke to the portrait of a household steeped in secrets. Though the family insisted on their love for Catherine, the inconsistencies in their stories whispered a different truth, one that promised to reveal far more than mere tragedy. Chapter 5: Clues in the Garden and Lost Jewels. Miss Marple stepped out into the garden of the Henshaw estate with the measured gait of one who has long learned that nature often holds the quietest of revelations. The garden, a symphony of colors and shapes, was at first glance an oasis of calm, neatly trimmed hedges, bursts of rose and lavender, and the gentle hum of nature going about its business. However, beneath the surface of this manicured beauty lay an undercurrent of tension, a subtle dissonance that resonated with each stride Miss Marple made was accompanied by a silent reflection of the talks she had had within the drawing room. There was discourse barely heard, undertones of envy, whispered confessions of financial anxiety, and the repeating, almost evasive reference of Catherine's missing diamonds to Miss Marple. These details were not trivial. Rather, they were the first clues in a mystery that threatened to unravel the very fabric of the family's facade. Before long, she reached a secluded area of the garden where an ancient oak tree stood as a silent sentinel over the estate. There, tending to a patch of vibrant marigolds, was Tom, the long-serving gardener, whose quiet diligence had always been a source of subtle wisdom. His hands, roughened from years of labor, moved with a practiced ease as he trimmed a wayward branch. Miss Marple welcomed him with a warm, polite nod, and soon enough, a conversation began in low, secretive tones. Miss Marple Tom began gazing about as if to verify that no one might overhear their chat. "I have long noticed that things here are not quite as they appear. Mrs. Beatrick, Henna, for example, has always had an eye for matters concerning money and legacy. Since Catherine's untimely death, there has been an added strain in the air, a preoccupation with wealth that is palpable in every gesture and glance." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly as she listened. "And what of Catherine's jewels?" she queried quietly, her tone conveying both interest and gentle hurry. Tom paused, his gaze falling to the worn soil at his feet, before he continued. "It has not missed my observation that some of the diamonds Catherine treasured have gone missing since that dreadful day in a house where every piece of wealth is so tenderly guarded. The disappearance of these treasures is hardly coincidental. They were more than mere adornments. They were symbols of the family's affluence, and perhaps even of their greed." The words struck a chord in Miss Marple's mind, and as she mulled over Tom's observations, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The family's casual conversations of finances, the furtive glances when the topic of the jewels came up, and the careful avoidance of disclosing their whereabouts now formed a consistent picture of hidden reasons and secrets. Miss Marple gently suggested that the jewels could have been deliberately taken as part of a larger scheme to divert suspicion or secure a personal gain. Tom's eyes are full of earnestness. Simplicity met hers with an unspoken recognition. He answered slowly, "I believe that in a household where wealth is both a blessing and a curse, the desire to possess what is not rightfully one's own can drive even the kindest souls to treachery." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The garden, with its hidden corners and rustling leaves, had become an unexpected repository of secrets. The immaculate care with which the estate was maintained seemed to conflict with the anarchy of human desire that lurked behind closed doors. Every rose and beautifully trimmed bush talked of beauty, but also of neglect, a carelessness born not of inattention, but of a willful blindness to the darker tendencies that had taken root among the family members. The gardener's frank views are resonating in her ears. Miss Marple walked slowly along a winding path, bordered by fragrant jasmine and wild dye. In the interplay of natural splendor and cultivated order, she saw a mirror of the Henshaw household. On the surface, everything appeared impeccable, but beneath lay an intricate web of deceit, envy, and hidden ambition. The missing jewels, once treasured heirlooms, now seemed to represent not only a tangible loss, but also the erosion of trust, and the insidious power of greed. As twilight began to settle over the estate, casting long contemplative shadows across the lawn, Miss Marple paused by a small fountain. The water's gentle murmur provided a soothing counterpoint to the relentless questions that swirled in her mind. Who had taken the jewels? What dark design could have compelled someone to the evidence gathered in the garden? And Tom's unvarnished observations were threads in a much larger tapestry of betrayal. Thus, as darkness settled over the estate, Miss Marple's mind churned with the possibilities in the silent sanctuary of the garden. Among the rustle of leaves and the soft whispers of the wind lay the first solid clues in a case that was anything but straightforward. With a determined heart and a mind sharpened by years of unraveling secrets, she vowed to Miss Marple's research took her to the silent room, where Catherine's lifeless remains had been discovered. The chamber was previously a sanctuary of pleasant repose, now seemed changed into a silent testament of hidden violence. Soft daylight filtered through a narrow window, producing long gloomy shadows on the polished wooden floor, though the scenario had been set up to resemble a peaceful, sorrowful suicide. Miss Marple's keen eyes quickly discerned that appearances were deliberately misleading. The body of Catherine was suspended in a manner that suggested careful staging, a meticulous effort to portray a picture of despair. However, as Miss Marple drew closer, subtle details betrayed a far different story. With slow, deliberate steps, she approached the figure, her gaze fixed on the small yet telling signs that the official narrative of suicide was nothing more than an artful deception. Crouching alongside the body, Miss Marple first examined Catherine's arm, where subtle but definite wounds scarred her skin, scars that told of a terrible battle rather than a serene conclusion. The markings were organized in a fashion that suggested the victim had not yielded quietly to despair, but had instead fought furiously against an invisible assailant. Each bruise and abrasion hinted at a violent encounter, evidence that Catherine had struggled until her death. Moments even more captivating was what Miss Marple saw at Catherine's hands. A close examination of her nails revealed traces of blood, tiny, almost undetectable flecks that had clung stubbornly to the keratin. The pattern of these stains was not random. It conveyed a story of frantic, desperate resistance. Catherine appeared to have clawed and fought back in her final moments, leaving behind a silent record of her struggle. In a case of genuine self-harm, such evidence of a physical fight would be unlikely. Instead, it was a grim indication that the body had been manipulated after a violent encounter, with the scene arranged to misdirect any inquiry. Miss Marple's trained eyes proceeded to study the surroundings. The way Catherine's body was hanged struck her as too purposeful. A person, in the throes of despair, would not have been capable of such a measured exhibition. The precise arrangement indicated that someone else had taken the effort to every component of the scene, from the precise placement of the torso to the positioning of personal effects, was created to inspire a narrative of intentional self-destruction. But in the subtle interplay of light and shadow, the true story was exposed through the physical evidence left on Catherine's limbs. A gentle, cool breeze drifted in through the open window, carrying with it the faint scent of the garden outside. In stark contrast to the chilling atmosphere of the room, this natural intrusion served as a poignant reminder that while nature moved in its eternal cycle, human cruelty had, in this instance, disrupted that harmony. Miss Marple's thoughts wandered to the implications of the facts before her. The scars, the blood on the nails, and the overly manufactured environment all pointed unmistakably to murder. Catherine's final act had not been one of despair, but of resistance, an act in which she battled for her life, if fleetingly, before succumbing to the violence inflicted upon her. Rose from her crouch, Miss Marple allowed herself a minute of calm meditation. The evidence that laid exposed was more than enough to deconstruct the narrative of suicide in that silent room. Every mark on Catherine's body was a clue, a piece of a puzzle that was slowly coming together. The deliberate arrangement of the body was in itself a betrayal. It was as though the murderer, in a misguided attempt to protect themselves, had tried to cloak the truth in the veneer of a self-inflicted death. But the brutality of the struggle was impossible to conceal. The gravity of the situation weighed on Miss Marple's heart. The quiet Catherine was silenced by a cruel hand, and the neatly prepared facade was an insult to the life that had once been full of promise. Taking one final long look at the situation, Miss Marple rose, carefully left the room, her resolve as firm as ever. Every detail, every single clue recorded in her mind was a step closer to uncovering the mystery. The silent testimony of Catherine's final moments stayed inscribed in her memories, a sad reminder that underlying every neatly manufactured fiction lay a truth waiting to be disclosed. Chapter 7. Gathering the suspect. In the mellow glow of an overcast afternoon, Miss Marple decided it was time to gather all the Hensa family members together for a last reckoning. The spacious drawing room of the Hensa estate, with its high ceilings and rows of ancestral portraits, was filled with a tense hush as each person assumed their place today. The air felt charged with the weight of unspoken truths, and every member of the family could sense that the time for evasions was drawing to an end. Assembled in the room were Mrs. Victoria, the domineering mother-in-law, whose every remark had been carefully picked Mr. Bernard Henshaw, Catherine's gentle husband, and the younger son whose anxious glances betrayed in a turmoil, and Mrs. Eleanor Allen's wife, whose cool detachment did little to hide her subtle unease, had been notably absent until now, had been Mr. Allen Henshaw, the elder son, and nominal out of two, or yet, by Miss Marple's invitation, he had arrived, a fact that had already begun to unsettle the delicate equilibrium of the household. Miss Marple, seated comfortably in an armchair that faced, "I have listened carefully to your accounts," she began, her tone both gentle and insistent. "Each of you holds a deep affection for Catherine, yet there are many discrepancies in your stories, especially when it comes to matters of money and trust." A murmur of acknowledgement swept through the room, but the tension only deepened. Turning her keen attention to Mr. Allen Henshaw, Miss Merrill said, "Mr. Henshaw, you claim that you work out of town and were not present on the day in question, but I have discovered evidence to the contrary." The silence that followed was palpable. Every eye was now concentrated on Allen, his face betraying a flash of nervousness as he struggled to retain his composure. "I guarantee you," he mumbled, "that I was away for many years and could not have been involved in such a disaster." Miss Merrill's eyes, however, remained steady. "It appears that the railway station records tell a different story," she said quietly. "I learned that you arrived that very day and then left again without saying anything to anyone." The room grew colder as the implications of her statement sank in. The elder son, who had long maintained a distant and untroubled facade, now looked increasingly cornered. "Would you be so kind as to remove your shirt?" Miss Marple asked calmly. "There is something I must examine," reluctantly, and with a visible shudder. Allen obeyed as his shirt was removed. Miss Marple's eyes instantly fell upon the thin scars gracing his chest. These were not ancient incidental marks, but fresh wounds echoing the bruises I noticed on Catherine's body, she thought softly. Allen's face flushed with a mixture of shame and resignation. The evidence before the gathering family was devastating, and in that tense moment, his carefully built alibi began to shatter. The room was silent save for the sound of his labored breathing, and then with a heavy sigh he spoke. "It is true," he confessed in a voice that trembled with regret. "I did return that day. I intended to surprise the family. I had not meant for any harm to come." The admission hung in the air, and Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze gentle but unyielding. "Then tell us, Mr. Henshaw, why did you kill Catherine?" she asked, each word deliberate and clear. Allen's eyes darted about the room before I saw my younger brother's wife. Catherine was arranging her jewelry. In that moment my heart was seized by a terrible instinct. I lost control, and in a fit of greed-filled fury, I attacked her. I wanted to make it appear as if she had taken her own life. A surprised scream rippled through the room. Mrs. Victoria's face stiffened as she stared at her son, while Bernard glanced away, his eyes welling with unshed tears. Mrs. Eleanor kept a hard expression, but the tightness in her hands was evident. Miss Marple continued in a calm tone, "It is a dreadful act, Mr. Henshaw, that not only claims a precious life, but undermines the very trust that brings a family together. Greed, if unrestrained, may turn even the most honorable hearts into instruments of betrayal." Allen bent his head in shame. "I only wish I could take it back," he mumbled, his voice thick with grief. "I acted out of a moment of uncontrollable emotion, driven by the lure of money and the fear of losing what I thought was mine. I never intended to cause such pain. But here we are with the truth laid bare." As the weight of his words settled, Miss Marple's calm presence seemed to console the room, even as the stark reality of the situation pressed down on each member of the family. She knew that in a household as complex as the Henshaws, many emotions and secrets lay intertwined at that moment. The local constabule, quietly alerted by Miss Marple's earlier observations, arrived to take Allen into custody. As he was led away, his eyes met those of the grieving family, a silent acknowledgement of the irreversible damage his actions had wrought. With the gathering dispersed and the immediate crisis resolved, Miss Marple remained sitting, considering the terrible unraveling of events in her gentle, presuming style. She had once again disclosed the darkness concealed beneath a veneer of respectability, proving that even the most well-guarded secrets eventually come to light. Chapter 8. Confession and Final Resolution. In the calm aftermath of the confession, the entire Shaw household lay wrapped in a heavy, meditative hush. The explosive atmosphere of the drawing room had given way to a melancholy stillness as each family member began to grapple with the destruction inflicted by Allen's revelation before dusk had sunk over the estate. The fading light reflecting the muted feelings within Miss Marple, ever the serene arbiter of truth, surveyed the scene with a mixture of melancholy and resolute pleasure that justice had been done, however delayed. The local police had led Allen away. His shoulders slumped under the weight of guilt and shame as he disappeared down the long road. The surviving family members sat in somber disorder. Mrs. Victoria's stern features had softened into an expression of sadness, as if the tight control she had so carefully maintained was suddenly breaking under the burden of obvious reality. Mr. Bernard Henshaw, Catherine's grieving husband, appeared lost in thought, his eyes searching the room for signs that might offer an explanation for the chaos that had appended his life. Even Mrs. Elaine Henshaw, who had maintained a veneer of cool detachment, now looked inwardly pained, her hands trembling ever so slightly as if to ward off the recollection of what had transpired. Miss Marple rose from her seat, her gentle eyes scanning the faces before her in her measured, unhurried manner. She began to recount the details that had pieced together the mystery. It was not a mind overcome by despair, as some might hastily conclude, she said softly, her voice resonating. With quiet authority, Catherine fought until her final moments, her scars and the blood on her nails testifying to a fierce and unyielding struggle. It was clear that she was not the A. She paused to let her words sink in, then added, and it was no accident that the diamonds that belonged to her heirlooms that had long been valued by this family had vanished. Their loss was part of a larger tapestry of greed and betrayal that had invaded this household. Miss Marple's eyes slid towards the assembled family as if to include each of them in her sweeping remark. Avarice, when left to fester, can transform even the most respected hearts into instruments of disaster. Here the lust for wealth and the desire to ensure a legacy. One man had committed an act that can never be undone, as she stated. Miss Merrill recalled the furtive glances, evasive responses, and subtle signals that had emerged during her investigations. Every interaction, whether in the drawing room or in the quiet areas of the estate, furnished her with clues that, when collected, created a story of hidden reasons and unsaid resentments. The reality, she stated, was not hidden in the official documents alone, but was etched in the very wounds on Catherine's body and the desperate deeds of a man who had lost control. Mrs. Victoria, whose earlier hardness had hidden her own inner turmoil, nodded slowly in response to the enticing lure of money. I always feared that our family's fixation with wealth may one day bring destruction, she acknowledged, her voice thick with guilt. I believed that Catherine's marriage would bring happiness rather than discord, but it appears that even in love, the specter of greed can loom big. Mr. Bernard Henshaw added quietly, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and compassion. I trusted that our bonds would be strong enough to shield us from such treachery, but instead we've all suffered immeasurably. The gravity of the situation had drawn out the hidden vulnerabilities of the family, and even Mrs. Eleanor, who had previously seemed so detached, appeared touched by the raw truth of the confession. Miss Marple said, in any family, there are secrets, and frequently those secrets are wrapped in the pretense of devoted and love. However, when money and inheritance become the main points of one's goals, the result can be a tragedy far greater than any that can be justified by the mere quest of fortune. Her words were gentle, but they carried the weight of her lifelong experience in understanding the human heart. I trust that you will in time come to see that Catherine's death was not the result of despair, but the consequence of a moment of uncontrolled passion, a moment in which one man allowed his baser instincts to override the bonds of kinship. As twilight deepened into night, Miss Marple bid the family farewell, leaving them with her final counsel. Let this be a lesson. Miss Marple walked away from the estate, her silhouette merging with the darkening landscape. She carried with her the quiet satisfaction of having restored order and justice, even as she lamented the irreparable loss of a kind soul. The echoes of the day's revelations would linger long in the minds of the Henshaw family, a somber reminder of how greed and unchecked ambition can shatter even the most cherished bonds. Catherine's memory would live on, not as a victim of despair, but as a beacon of truth in a family that had lost its path. Miss Marple, with her unwavering insight into the human condition, knew that while justice had been served, the path to healing was long and arduous, one that would require the survivors to confront not only the loss of a beloved sister and wife, but also the deeper fractures that had allowed such a tragedy to unfold.